As the world watched with bated breath on April 26, 2025, the funeral of Pope Francis unfolded in Vatican City, bringing together political leaders and dignitaries from across the globe. But amidst the somber occasion, one leader's presence seemed particularly poignant: Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. For Meloni, the Pope's death represented more than just a loss of a religious figure. It highlighted the stark contrast between her nationalist political stance and the progressive values Pope Francis championed throughout his papacy. Pope Francis had been a transformative figure in the Catholic Church, pushing the institution toward modern inclusive policies. His papacy was marked by calls for greater social justice, protection of the environment, and compassion for refugees. However, these progressive values stood in stark contrast to the hard-right nationalism that Meloni and her government have embraced. The conflict between the Pope's values and Meloni's politics raised many questions as to how the Prime Minister would navigate this crucial moment. On the surface, Meloni's presence at the funeral seemed inevitable. As the leader of Italy, she had an obligation to attend and pay respects to the Pope, who had served as a spiritual leader not only for Catholics, but for millions around the world. The Vatican, after all, holds a place of deep reverence in Italy, and the Pope's influence stretched far beyond the confines of the Church. But in attending the funeral, Meloni found herself in an uncomfortable position. Pope Francis had long been vocal in his opposition to the rise of nationalism across Europe, often criticizing populist leaders and their rhetoric. He stood for a global, inclusive vision, calling for unity among nations in the face of global challenges like climate change, inequality, and migration. Meloni, however, had built her political career on a platform of nationalism, advocating for the protection of national borders, rejecting mass immigration, and prioritizing the interests of Italy above all else. This fundamental ideological divide between the Pope and the Prime Minister made the funeral a complex moment for Meloni. As Meloni attended the funeral, it was clear that she was walking a political tightrope. On the one hand, as the Italian head of government, her attendance was essential for the sake of diplomacy. However, it also exposed the deep fissures between the values she espoused and those that the Pope had spent his life championing. For many, the funeral was not just a moment of mourning. It was also a reflection of the growing divide between the progressive, globalist politics of the Pope and the rise of right-wing nationalism in Europe. For many observers, the key question was whether Meloni would continue to hold fast to her nationalist policies, or whether Pope Francis's death could provide an opportunity for reflection. Would she, in the face of this global loss, adjust her approach to align more closely with the Pope's call for compassion and solidarity, or would she remain committed to her hard-right agenda? One area of tension between Pope Francis and Meloni was immigration. The Pope had long advocated for a compassionate approach to migrants and refugees, calling on European nations to provide sanctuary to those fleeing war, violence, and poverty. Pope Francis viewed migration as a moral issue, emphasizing the need for solidarity with the most vulnerable. Meloni, on the other hand, had adopted a more restrictive immigration policy, emphasizing national security and the protection of Italian borders. Her government had introduced measures to prevent the entry of migrants, sparking both domestic and international debate. The funeral served as a moment to reflect on the divergent approaches to this critical issue. Another key issue that separated the two was the environment. Pope Francis had dedicated much of his papacy to raising awareness about the climate crisis. His 2015 encyclical Laudato Si called for urgent action to address climate change and protect the planet for future generations. His environmental activism was a cornerstone of his leadership. In contrast, Meloni's government had been less enthusiastic about climate policies, prioritizing economic growth and national interests over aggressive climate action. This ideological rift, too, was highlighted at the funeral, as the Pope's legacy in environmental advocacy could not be ignored. As Meloni stood at the funeral, many were keen to see how she would respond to the Pope's legacy. Would she pay lip service to his values, recognizing his importance as a global figure, Or would she take this opportunity to embrace a more inclusive and compassionate approach to politics? The funeral became a moment not only for grieving, but also for political reflection. Pope Francis's death also prompted questions about the future of Italy's relationship with the Catholic Church.